I came home to find a concrete drone launch pad in my cornfield, 4 generations of family corn, gone, replaced by some HOA committee's pet project while I was on a business trip. I'm standing here shaking, not just from anger, but from something else these people don't understand yet. They think they picked on some quiet government worker who won't cause trouble. Wrong. My boring desk job involves keeping unauthorized aircraft out of places they absolutely cannot go. And their beautiful new drone facility, it just landed in the worst possible location they could have chosen. Drop a comment if strangers ever destroyed something irreplaceable while you were away. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped outside that Tuesday morning and saw 3 guys in expensive surveying gear measuring my cornfield like they already owned the place. Picture this. Dawn breaking over 12 acres of corn that's been in my family for 40 years. And these strangers are out there with their fancy equipment, acting like they belonged. The first thing I did was march straight to that bright orange sign they'd planted overnight right in the middle of my crops. HOA Development Zone, it read. I ripped that thing out of the ground so fast you'd think it was on fire. Let me paint you a picture of where this all went down. Our little town used to be something special before Hartfield Manufacturing packed up and left 18 months ago. Now, when I drive through downtown, it's like looking at a ghost town. Empty storefronts with 4 lease signs that nobody's calling about. The old diner that used to serve the best pie in 3 counties shuttered up tight, and my neighbor's foreclosure notice is still taped to his front door. 847 people lost their jobs when that plant closed. And in a town of 3,200 souls, that's the kind of economic devastation that makes people desperate for any promise of salvation. My name's Jack, and I've been living the quiet life here with my wife, Tracy, for the past 8 years since my transfer brought us to this area. Tracy teaches high school math and has the patience of a saint, while I work what most people would call a boring government aviation job at Wright-Patterson. I don't talk much about the specifics because, honestly, most folks' eyes glaze over when I start explaining airspace coordination protocols. We inherited this 12-acre spread from my father, who bought it back in the 1970s with dreams of gentleman farming. The cornfield isn't just land to me, it's memory, legacy, the kind of place where a man can stand at sunset and feel connected to something bigger than himself. That's exactly what I was doing when this woman, Miranda, showed up with our HOA president, Robert, trailing behind her like a nervous puppy. Now, I need you to understand something about Robert. The guy's about as assertive as a wet paper towel on a good day. But here he was, stammering through what sounded like a prepared speech about community enhancement surveys, while this Miranda woman kept whispering corrections in his ear and then smoothly taking over the conversation. Watching her work was like watching a puppet master who wasn't even trying to hide the strings. "Mr. Jack," Miranda said with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, "I'm sure you want what's best for our community's economic recovery." She had this folder full of professional-looking documents showing overwhelming support for some kind of recreational drone facility that would bring jobs back to our struggling area. 73% community approval, according to her survey. The problem was, I never got that survey, and when I glanced over at my neighbors, Tom and Pete, they looked just as surprised as I felt. Tom Bradley's been my friend since I moved here. Retired teacher, good man, but I could see the economic pressure weighing on him. "Jack, we need something to bring jobs back to replace Hartfield Manufacturing," he said, and Pete nodded along. "My construction business hasn't had a major contract in 8 months since the plant closure." Here's where Miranda got really interesting. She started asking these seemingly casual questions about my work schedule, when Tracy leaves for school, and what times we're usually home during the week. Most people would chalk it up to neighbor small talk, but 18 years in military service teaches you to notice when someone's gathering intelligence. The way she filed away every answer, the little notes she made in that leather portfolio, this wasn't casual conversation. This was reconnaissance. The economic hook she dangled was impressive, I'll give her that. 1.2 million in annual tax revenue, over 200 construction jobs, 85 permanent positions at this proposed facility. She had charts, projections, and testimonials from other communities that had supposedly benefited from similar developments. For people watching their town die a slow economic death, these weren't just numbers, they were lifelines. When you're drowning, you don't ask too many questions about the guy throwing you the rope, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. Maybe it was the way Robert kept glancing nervously at Miranda whenever he tried to speak, or how she had answers ready for questions nobody had asked yet. When I pressed for details about property assessments and legal procedures, Miranda mentioned something about legal options available under community development statutes if I didn't cooperate with the overwhelming community will. She didn't make it sound like a threat, but the message was crystal clear: play ball or face consequences. Tracy came home right as this little meeting was wrapping up, and I watched her teacher instincts kick in immediately. 23 years of dealing with teenagers gives you a sixth sense for when someone's running a con, and I could see it in her face. She didn't trust Miranda's smooth explanations about neighborhood improvement for 1 second. After they left, Tracy just looked at me and said, "Jack, that woman was measuring us the whole time she was talking. Smart lady, my wife." That evening, I'm checking the mail when I notice something's wrong. The mailbox has been forced open, not broken exactly, but definitely tampered with. Mail scattered inside, stuff that should have been organized was all mixed up. And there, sitting right on top of the pile like it belonged there, was a county notice about a preliminary development assessment scheduled for my property in 2 weeks. Assessment I never requested for a project I never approved, on land I clearly own. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The assessment form was already partially filled out with details about my property layout. Specific measurements, soil composition notes, and drainage patterns. Information that somebody could only know if they'd been inside my fence line, walking my land, studying my property like they were planning to take it. I'm standing there in my driveway, holding this paper, realizing that someone has been casing my family's land without permission. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, who had access to information they shouldn't have had, who was confident enough to leave evidence of their reconnaissance right in my mailbox. Is the phone number listed for questions? Miranda's contact information, of course. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole community development pitch was just the opening move in a much bigger game. And whatever Miranda was really after, she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd picked a fight with someone who spent his career thinking 3 moves ahead. 4 days later, I'm packing my go-bag for an urgent Pentagon assignment when Tracy mentions that Miranda had called the house twice, asking about my travel schedule. Coincidence? In my line of work, you learn not to believe in coincidences. The timing felt too convenient, like someone wanted me out of the picture while they made their next move. Military crisis or not, leaving Tracy alone right now felt like walking into an ambush with my eyes closed. The Pentagon briefing was classified, but I can tell you it involved coordinating airspace restrictions for a multi-agency operation. While I'm sitting in war rooms dealing with flight patterns and communication protocols, my mind keeps drifting back to those surveying guys in my cornfield. Something about their equipment bothered me. Too expensive for a simple property assessment, too sophisticated for what Miranda claimed they were doing. During breaks between meetings, I started making some discreet phone calls about Miranda's background, and what I found made my stomach drop. 2 previous towns, both rural, both economically struggling. Both had experienced sudden property development booms that displaced longtime residents. She had a pattern, and we were just the latest target. Back home, Tracy was doing her own detective work. She's got these binoculars I bought her for bird watching, and she'd been using them to observe the expensive cars arriving at Miranda's house for what looked like investor meetings. License plates from Columbus, Cincinnati, Chicago, not local residents, but serious out-of-town money. "Jack," she told me over our secure phone line, "these aren't community meetings. These are business negotiations, and we're the commodity being discussed." The harassment started the morning after I left. Construction crews showed up at 6 in the morning with surveying equipment that sounded like they were building a runway. Workers who somehow kept accidentally blocking Tracy's driveway right when she needed to leave for school, making her late for classes she'd never missed in 23 years of teaching. Her garden is getting damaged by heavy equipment that had no business being anywhere near our flower beds. All technically legal under some vague community access provision that Robert had apparently signed off on. But Tracy's tougher than these people realized. I'd taught her some basic counter-surveillance techniques over the years, how to document evidence, what angles to photograph, how to timestamp and GPS coordinate everything for potential legal use. What she discovered during those 4 days made my blood boil. Drone flights over our property at all hours, not just daytime surveying, but nighttime reconnaissance using what looked like infrared cameras. Someone was mapping our daily routines, learning when we were home, when we were vulnerable, when they could operate without witnesses. The school board meeting that week revealed just how deep this economic manipulation went. Tracy attended and learned that the district was facing a $2.3 million budget shortfall, requiring 12 teacher layoffs. The principal mentioned that possible property tax increases from Miranda's development could save teaching positions. Suddenly, Tracy understood why parents who had always been friendly were treating her coldly in the hallways. She wasn't just Jack's wife anymore. She was the obstacle standing between their children's teachers and unemployment. Pete's situation was even worse than I'd realized. Tracy overheard him on desperate phone calls about overdue equipment loans dating back to the Hartfield plant closure. His construction business was 3 months behind on payments, and his house was facing foreclosure. When Miranda offered to help with his cash flow problems in exchange for construction support, Tracy realized we were watching a man's financial desperation being weaponized against his conscience. Pete had been my friend for 8 years, but friendship doesn't pay equipment loans or prevent foreclosure notices. From 1,500 miles away, I guided Tracy through documenting everything. Military-grade surveillance requires attention to detail most people don't possess, but Tracy's a teacher. She knows how to follow instructions and gather evidence systematically. The photos she sent me showed drone flights at altitudes that should have required FAA authorization, crossing airspace patterns that I knew were problematic for reasons I couldn't explain over unsecured phone lines. These weren't hobbyist flights. This was professional-grade intelligence gathering. The most disturbing discovery came on my last night away. Tracy was using the long-range binoculars to observe what she thought was another investor meeting at Miranda's house, when she noticed the conversation had moved outside. With the telephoto capability, she could see documents being passed around, and one of them looked like an aerial photograph of our property with annotations. Not just current photos, but historical images showing seasonal crop patterns, vehicle parking habits, and even the location of our septic system. Someone had been studying our land for months, maybe longer. Miranda's investor calls that Tracy overheard mentioned terms that made my skin crawl: radar response testing and federal approval protocols that sounded distinctly military-related. I couldn't tell Tracy over the phone why those phrases terrified me, but in my line of work, when civilians start talking about radar testing near restricted airspace, people in my pay grade start asking very serious questions about national security implications. The fourth night, Tracy discovered something that changed everything. She was documenting the routine surveillance drones when one of them did something different. It changed course immediately when it spotted her behind the barn. Not a random flight pattern adjustment, but a deliberate response to her presence. This wasn't passive observation anymore. Something was actively hunting information about us, and it knew she was watching back. When I finally got home, Tracy met me in the driveway with emergency bags already packed. "Jack," she whispered, "I found something in Miranda's trash, a document with our daily schedules, photos of you leaving for work, times when I'm alone at the house. But that's not the scary part. The scary part is the red X marked over our house with a date, tomorrow's date. We need to leave, now." I looked at my wife's face in the porch light and saw something I'd never seen in 25 years of marriage. Genuine fear. Not concern, not worry, but the kind of primal fear that comes from realizing you're being hunted by something bigger and more dangerous than you understood. Tracy had been alone for 4 days while sophisticated professionals mapped our vulnerabilities, and tomorrow they were planning something that required us to be gone. Standing there holding those emergency bags, I realized this wasn't just about property development anymore. Miranda had made this personal, and she'd threatened the one thing I'd sworn to protect with my life. My wife wasn't just collateral damage in some real estate scheme. She was a target. Time to remind these people what happens when you threaten a military family. Coming home to find 2 acres of my father's corn destroyed for comprehensive soil testing was like taking a punch to the gut from someone you'd trusted. The destruction wasn't random. Every damaged row showed professional planning, calculated to maximize psychological impact while staying technically legal. I walked those ruined fields with Tracy that morning, seeing 40 years of family history trampled by machines that had no business being there, and felt something cold and military settle into my mind. This was warfare, just fought with lawyers and bulldozers instead of bullets. The emergency HOA meeting that night was standing room only, and I could feel the tension the moment we walked in. Robert was up front looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth, while Miranda sat in the back row orchestrating everything with hand signals and whispered instructions. You want to see a puppet master at work? Watch someone who's perfected the art of controlling weak men through their fears. Every time Robert tried to speak off script, Miranda would catch his eye, and he'd immediately stammer back to whatever she'd prepared for him. I just sign what the development committee recommends, he admitted when I cornered him before the meeting. Miranda handles all the technical details. Pete showed up looking like he hadn't slept in weeks, and I knew why. Miranda had him exactly where she wanted him, trapped between betraying his oldest friend and watching his business collapse. The shame on his face when he admitted she'd offered to pay his overdue loans in exchange for construction support was painful to watch. Jack, he said, not meeting my eyes, I'm 3 months behind on everything. The house, the equipment, my kid's college fund. I don't know what else to do. Tom Bradley pulled me aside before the meeting started, and I could see the conflict tearing him apart. Jack, I've got 3 teachers facing layoffs since Hartfield closed. Miranda's development plan could save their jobs. When I tried to explain that something wasn't right about this whole situation, he cut me off. Then explain it, because right now, you just look selfish while families are struggling. That hurt, coming from a man I'd considered a friend, but I understood the pressure he was feeling. When people are drowning, they'll grab onto anything that looks like salvation. Miranda's presentation that night was masterful. Slick graphics, economic projections that painted pictures of prosperity, testimonials from grateful communities. She revealed the financial details with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Current property worth $840,000 agricultural, rezoning potential of 2.1 million commercial WOSU, construction phase, employing over 200 workers for 6 months, permanent facility creating 85 ongoing jobs. But I wasn't looking at her charts. I was watching her technique. This wasn't community service. This was sophisticated property speculation, using economic desperation as a weapon. The soil contamination report she presented was particularly impressive. Professional formatting, official-looking seals, detailed chemical analysis showing petroleum contamination requiring immediate remediation. Too bad I'd examined those soil samples myself and found motor oil mixed with dirt. Professional fraud operation designed to justify emergency seizure, executed by someone who understood exactly how rural property law worked. Miranda had done her homework on more than just our community's economic vulnerability. The community forum that followed was brutal to watch. These were people I'd barbecued with, shared beers with, who'd welcomed Tracy and me when we first moved here 8 years ago. Now they were looking at me like I was some kind of villain for wanting to keep my own family land. Miranda's projections showed specific benefits everyone could understand. Pete's construction contracts worth $300,000 over 6 months. The school district gaining $400,000 annually in tax revenue, preventing teacher layoffs, and downtown businesses seeing 40% increases in customer traffic from facility workers. For people watching their town die slowly since the plant closure, I wasn't defending property rights. I was blocking their economic salvation. This community has supported you for 8 years, one neighbor called out. Now it's time for you to support us. Another voice from the crowd, military pension must be nice, but the rest of us need jobs. The hardest part was seeing the desperation in their faces. Good people who'd been pushed to the breaking point, willing to turn on neighbors if it meant their families could survive. Miranda had read the room perfectly, exploited every pressure point, and turned legitimate economic anxiety into a weapon against anyone who opposed her plans. The vote wasn't even close, 47-3 supporting expedited assessment with emergency seizure authority. Only Tracy, I, and one elderly veteran voted against the motion. Even Tom voted with the majority, avoiding my eyes as he raised his hand. Pete abstained, which was probably the best I could have hoped for, from a man whose financial survival depended on Miranda's promises. Robert called it the will of the community, but his hands were shaking as he announced the results. Miranda's victory speech was everything I had expected. Gracious thanks to the community, promises of prosperity and renewal, assurances that displaced residents would be fairly compensated for their sacrifice. But she made one critical error in her moment of triumph, demanding immediate emergency seizure without the standard 30-day appeal period. Even some of her supporters looked uncomfortable when Robert nervously suggested they should maybe follow normal procedures, only to be steamrolled by Miranda's insistence that economic emergency requires immediate action. Walking out of that community center felt like leaving a funeral. These people had known me for 8 years, watched me help neighbors with everything from moving furniture to fixing farm equipment, and seen Tracy volunteer at every school function and community event. Now they were celebrating my family's dispossession, like it was some kind of victory for justice. Economic desperation hadn't just made them vulnerable to outside manipulation, it had turned them into willing participants in their neighbor's destruction. That night, I made a phone call that I'd been putting off, using a secure line to contact Colonel Davis at Wright-Patterson. "Jim," I said, "I need you to confirm Tuesday training schedules for the Charlie 7 corridor." There was a long pause before he answered. "Jack, why are you asking about classified flight patterns on an unsecured topic?" I couldn't tell him everything, not yet, but I could hear the concern in his voice when I mentioned unusual drone activity in restricted airspace. 3 hours later, Jim called back with information that made my blood run cold. "Jack, those drone signatures we've been tracking aren't just testing our response times. They're mapping our operational patterns, learning our blind spots, gathering data that could compromise national security. Someone is planning something significant, and from the geographical data, your property appears to be the staging ground. I can't discuss details over regular phone lines, but we need to meet. Tonight. And Jack, come alone." Sitting in my truck outside the community center at midnight, waiting for a classified briefing about threats to national security, I finally understood what we were really dealing with. This wasn't just property fraud or economic exploitation. Miranda had brought something much more dangerous to our little town, and my neighbors had just voted to hand her the keys to operations that could threaten military installations. They thought they were saving their community. Instead, they'd just authorized something that could destroy it. I should have known that filing formal FAA complaints would be like sending up a flare to let Miranda know exactly who she was dealing with. But sitting in my kitchen that morning, looking at documented evidence of airspace violations and fraudulent environmental reports, I thought I had her cornered. Military training teaches you to gather intelligence before engaging the enemy, but sometimes intelligence gathering tips your hand to an opponent who's smarter than you realized. The moment those federal complaints hit the system with my name attached, Miranda knew she wasn't facing some random rural property owner. She was up against someone with aviation expertise and government connections. Her response was swift and surgical. Within 24 hours, she'd shifted from property developer to character assassin, and her new strategy was terrifyingly effective. Professional consultants appeared overnight with psychological profiles, social media analysis, and carefully constructed narratives about unstable military backgrounds and government paranoia affecting civilian communities. They'd done their homework on me, digging up every transfer, every deployment, every time I'd been stationed somewhere that might suggest problematic psychological issues. The fact that none of it was true didn't matter. Perception was reality, and Miranda was reshaping community perception with the precision of a military campaign. The public hearing was orchestrated like a show trial. Miranda had professional legal representation, live stream coverage, and a packed audience that felt more like a lynch mob than concerned citizens. I walked into that community center alone. No attorney, because I'd thought truth and evidence would be enough. No expert witnesses, because I'd assumed my 18 years of military service would carry weight with people who had known me for 8 years. Standing there facing 100 hostile neighbors while cameras rolled, I felt like I was being court-martialed for crimes I didn't commit in a language I didn't speak. Their case wasn't about facts. It was a storyboard built to make me look unstable and selfish, while her charts promised jobs. It worked on people who needed hope more than they needed the truth. When my turn came to present evidence of airspace violations, the microphone system mysteriously malfunctioned right as I started explaining federal aviation regulations. Audio cutting out during the most crucial part of my testimony. While the crowd grew impatient and hostile, Tracy jumped up from the audience. "Let him speak." "This is rigged." Security immediately moved to escort her out, while the crowd actually cheered her removal as disruptive behavior. Watching my wife being physically removed from a public hearing for demanding I be allowed to present evidence was like watching democracy die in real time. The live stream moment that went viral was everything Miranda had orchestrated it to be. Local news had edited the footage to show an angry military veteran disrupting community development meeting, with my audio conveniently missing during the technical explanations and only capturing my frustrated reactions to being silenced. Social media exploded with commentary from people who'd never been to our town. Entitled government worker blocks jobs for entire community. Selfish military guy thinks he owns the sky. This is why veterans need better mental health support. The national narrative painted me as the villain blocking economic progress, while Miranda became the hero fighting for struggling families. The documentary evidence Miranda's team presented was impressive in its thoroughness. Environmental assessments backdated to before construction began, economic impact studies showing specific job creation numbers, petition signatures that included residents who'd died years ago, and people who had moved away decades earlier. But the most damaging evidence was psychological, professional evaluations recommending therapy for my pathological resistance to community cooperation, social media analysis showing my pattern of antisocial behavior, expert testimony about how military service could create civilian adjustment disorders that manifested as property HOAing and authority conflicts. By then, she wasn't even pretending to respect the process. She pressed for seizure on the spot, and Robert folded. The community's reaction was the most painful part of the entire ordeal. People I'd helped move furniture, neighbors whose cars I'd jumped in winter storms, parents whose kids Tracy had tutored for free. They all stood up to applaud my family's legal destruction, like it was some kind of victory celebration. Jack's always been arrogant about his government job, someone called out. Military pension makes him greedy for more money, another voice added. He doesn't care if our children have no economic future after Hartfield closed. These weren't strangers attacking my character. These were people who'd eaten at my table, people I'd considered friends. Tom's public betrayal cut the deepest. He took the microphone with the authority of someone who'd taught high school for 30 years and said, "I've known Jack for 8 years since he moved here after his military transfer. He's a decent man, but he's wrong about this. Our community's survival after Hartfield's closure matters more than one man's property rights." Hearing those words from someone I'd trusted, someone whose judgment I'd respected, felt like being stabbed in the back by family. Pete's testimony was almost worse because I could see the guilt destroying him as he spoke. Jack's land is ideal for economic development that could replace what we lost when Hartfield closed. As a contractor, the construction phase will employ hundreds of local workers who've been unemployed for 18 months. His voice broke on almost every word, but financial desperation had made him choose Miranda's promises over 20 years of friendship. I didn't blame him. I understood the pressure he was facing, but understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. The final vote was 8-1 for immediate property seizure under community economic emergency provisions. The same elderly veteran who'd voted with me earlier cast the lone dissenting vote, muttering something about due process and constitutional rights that nobody wanted to hear. I had 72 hours to vacate family land that had been in our possession for 40 years or face sheriff's enforcement. The crowd's celebration felt like a gladiator arena after a particularly brutal execution. Walking out of that hearing, I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. Complete isolation, community rejection, legal defeat, friends' betrayal, national humiliation through social media, everything I'd built over 8 years of civilian life had been destroyed in 2 hours by a woman who'd studied our community's vulnerabilities like a military target. My training had prepared me for combat, but nobody teaches you how to fight a war where the weapons are legal documents and the battlefield is your neighbor's economic desperation. Tracy was waiting in the parking lot with emergency bags already in the truck. "We're leaving tonight," she said simply. "I found something that changes everything." She handed me a crumpled document she'd retrieved from Miranda's trash, our daily schedules, photographs of me leaving for work, and detailed notes about when I was alone at the house. At the bottom, someone had drawn a red X over our address with tomorrow's date written underneath. Whatever Miranda was planning, Phase 1 was complete, and Phase 2 required us to be gone. That night, as we drove to a hotel in the next county, I realized that everything I'd thought I understood about this situation had been wrong. Miranda wasn't just some property speculator exploiting economic desperation. She was something much more dangerous, and tomorrow we were going to find out exactly what that meant. Miranda's grand opening celebration was everything she'd promised the community: local news coverage, investor presentations, a job fair where desperate residents could apply for construction positions that might actually exist. Hundreds of people gathered on what used to be my family's cornfield to witness the historic first flight of a drone facility that would supposedly bring economic salvation to our struggling town. perfect weather conditions made it an ideal day for aviation demonstrations, which was exactly what terrified me as I watched F-16 contrails appear on the southern horizon right on schedule. You see, there's something Miranda had never bothered to check during all her careful planning and community manipulation. Every Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning, for the past 18 years, the Phantom Leader Squadron from Wright-Patterson runs low-level combat training on Training Route Charlie 7. It's public information, published 6 months in advance on FAA websites, available to anyone who cares about not killing military pilots. But Miranda was too busy measuring property values and calculating profit margins to bother with trivial details like federal aviation schedules. The collision crisis unfolded exactly as I'd feared it would. At 10:25, Miranda's demonstration drone launched to an altitude of 800 feet for what she called a community showcase of our facility's capabilities. At 10:28, I spotted aircraft contrails across the southern horizon, exactly where they'd been every Tuesday for nearly 2 decades. The Phantom Leader Squadron was approaching for their scheduled low-level combat pass at 200 feet above ground level, and Miranda's drone was climbing directly into their flight path. Anyone who understood military aviation could see what was about to happen. A mid-air collision that would kill pilots and destroy $60 million worth of military aircraft on live television. I sprinted toward the drone control station like my life depended on it, because other people's lives actually did. "Abort now!" I shouted at the operator, some kid who probably thought operating drones was just like playing video games. "You have no authority here," he shot back. "Security, get this guy away from the equipment." That's when I did something I'd hoped never to do in civilian life. I flashed my military identification and used the voice that had commanded airspace operations for 18 years. "Deputy Commander, Airspace Security Division. Shut it down immediately." The emergency radio was right where it should be, and I grabbed it with hands that weren't shaking, despite everything that depended on the next 30 seconds. "Phantom Leader, this is Airspace Control. Break right immediately. Civilian aircraft at your 12 o'clock high." The response was instant. F-16s executing sharp evasive maneuvers in full view of hundreds of community members and news cameras. The sonic boom from their evasive action shattered windows in the community center and sent children crying into their parents' arms. But it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, because it meant nobody died that day. The crowd fell silent as they realized what they'd just witnessed. 800 feet of vertical separation had become 47 feet of horizontal separation in less than 10 seconds of reaction time. The demonstration drone, still climbing obliviously through airspace that should have been cleared hours ago, missed colliding with military aircraft by a distance you could throw a football. On live television, with news cameras rolling, our entire community had come within seconds of watching multiple people die because someone was too arrogant to check public aviation schedules. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the sudden silence, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 18 years preventing exactly this kind of disaster, "I coordinate civilian airspace safety for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base within a 25-mile radius. Every civilian aircraft above 400 feet requires military clearance under Federal Aviation Regulation Part 99. What you just witnessed could have killed 2 pilots and destroyed military aircraft worth more than this entire town's annual budget." The reaction was immediate and devastating for Miranda's carefully constructed narrative. Tom Bradley, who'd voted against me just days earlier, stood up and said, "Miranda, he just saved lives. What the hell were you thinking?" Other voices joined in. "Those planes were really close. We could have killed someone. Did she know about the military flights?" The community that had celebrated my legal destruction 3 days ago was suddenly seeing me as the person who had protected them from participating in an aviation disaster. I didn't argue the point twice. I just told the cameras the schedule was public and that any responsible operator would have checked it before launching a drone into shared airspace. "How could I predict military training schedules?" she demanded. "Ma'am," I replied, "they're posted 6 months in advance. Public information that takes 5 minutes to verify." The technical explanation I gave to news cameras was probably more detailed than most viewers wanted, but accuracy mattered when lives had been at stake. Commercial drones above 400 feet lose transponder effectiveness, making them invisible to military radar systems. F-16s on combat training at 500 knots closing speed cannot detect small aircraft below their sensor thresholds. At that velocity, collision would have been unsurvivable for pilots and catastrophic for anyone on the ground when 60,000 pounds of burning aircraft fell out of the sky. Federal Aviation Administration emergency response arrived within 2 hours. Helicopters, investigation teams, officials with authority to ground every aircraft within 50 miles if necessary. All drone operations were immediately prohibited pending federal investigation. Miranda's investor calls turned into screaming matches about liability exposure and insurance cancellations, and county officials started distancing themselves from permits they'd approved without proper oversight. The community celebration became a crime scene investigation, complete with evidence markers and federal witness interviews. Tom's public redemption moment meant more to me than any official vindication could have. He approached me in front of the news cameras and said, "Jack, I was wrong to doubt you. You tried to warn us, and I didn't listen because I was scared about our economic future. What can I do to help fix this mess?" Other neighbors started approaching with similar apologies. People who had voted to seize my property, realizing they'd been manipulated into supporting something that could have killed their own children. The social media reversal was swift and complete. The same platforms that had vilified me 48 hours earlier were now sharing footage of "Military Hero Prevents Aviation Disaster" and "Veterans' Expertise Saves Community from Catastrophe." The live stream that was supposed to show Miranda's triumph instead captured the moment an entire town realized they'd been manipulated into supporting something criminally dangerous. Comment sections are filled with military families sharing stories about airspace safety and civilian responsibility. Colonel Davis arrived that evening with information that changed everything I thought I understood about Miranda's operation. "Jack, those drone flights weren't just testing our response times. They were gathering comprehensive data on military radar protocols, response patterns, and communication frequencies. Intelligence worth millions to foreign entities. Someone paid significant money to use your neighborhood as a testing ground for operations that could compromise national security." As Tracy and I drove home from what should have been our property's destruction, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The black sedan in my rearview mirror had been following us since we left the community center, matching every turn, maintaining a consistent distance like professional surveillance. It wasn't Miranda. She was still dealing with federal investigators and news reporters. So, who was following us, and why did they think we needed to have a conversation now that their aviation testing operation had been exposed? I'd thought stopping the drone demonstration was the end of this nightmare. Instead, it was just the moment I realized how much bigger and more dangerous this conspiracy really was. Miranda might have been the face of the operation, but someone else had been pulling her strings all along, and now they knew exactly who had disrupted their carefully planned intelligence-gathering mission. The aviation disaster I'd prevented was just the opening act. The real show was about to begin. Miranda's complete meltdown in the community center parking lot was something to behold. I watched her make increasingly desperate phone calls while federal investigators photographed every piece of equipment she'd brought to our town. "The liability insurance is canceled," she screamed into her phone. "You can't pull funding after one operational failure." Her professional composure, the smooth confidence that had manipulated an entire community, cracked like ice under spring sun. How was I supposed to predict military training schedules? She demanded of whoever was on the other end, apparently forgetting that public aviation information isn't exactly classified material. Colonel Davis pulled me aside with intelligence that made everything click into place. "Jack, TechFlow Dynamics isn't just some drone company. They operate as a front for foreign intelligence services, specifically targeting military installations for radar response analysis. Miranda was paid $500,000 to facilitate systematic testing of our defense capabilities, but she got greedy and expanded the operation into personal property speculation. Double profit, intelligence money plus real estate development. Neighbors finally asked the only question that mattered. Did you check for military traffic? When she said civilians can't access those schedules, the room went quiet. Everyone understood she hadn't done the most basic due diligence. Pete's confession to the local news crew was probably the hardest thing I'd ever watched a friend do. "I need to tell the truth publicly," he said, his voice shaking with guilt and relief. "Miranda exploited my bankruptcy fears to manipulate me into betraying my best friend. She promised $300,000 in construction contracts, but it was all deception to use my equipment for her intelligence-gathering scheme." Watching Pete expose his financial desperation on television took courage. I'm not sure I would have had in his position. The tech company's abandonment happened right there in front of news cameras, and it was brutal. Miranda's corporate handler called while she was trying to manage the federal investigation, and the conversation went on speakerphone by accident. All operations terminated immediately, the voice said with corporate coldness. Legal liability exceeds acceptable parameters. When Miranda protested that they had binding contracts, the response was swift. Legal team advises complete disconnection from all associated entities. Good luck with your federal investigation. Community members started confronting Miranda with specific accusations that showed how thoroughly they'd researched her background once the truth started coming out. You faked those environmental contamination reports. You forged petition signatures, including my dead grandmother. You nearly caused an aviation disaster for foreign money. The most devastating question came from Janet, whose husband had served in Vietnam. How much were foreign companies paying you to gather intelligence on our military bases? Federal Bureau of Investigation agents arrived that afternoon to question Miranda about her connections to foreign intelligence operations. TechFlow Dynamics was already under investigation for selling military response data to prohibited international clients, and Miranda's operation had provided real-time testing data worth millions on the black market. Watching her realize she was facing potential espionage charges rather than simple fraud was like watching someone discover they'd been swimming with sharks. Tom Bradley organized an immediate community meeting to support our family, and the turnout was remarkable. Military spouses shared stories about the quiet help I'd provided over the years, assistance with deployment logistics when their husbands were overseas, guidance through base housing bureaucracy, crisis support during family emergencies. People realized they'd almost lost a neighbor who'd been silently serving their community for 8 years while asking for nothing in return. By the weekend, the same feeds that roasted me were passing the hat for our legal bills. Pete's public refusal to participate in Miranda's final desperate schemes was the moment I knew our friendship would survive this ordeal. When she tried to organize one last private meeting with remaining supporters, he stood up and announced, "This woman nearly destroyed our community for foreign money. She turned our economic desperation into a weapon against ourselves and our neighbors." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned a hard lesson about the cost of compromising principles for financial survival. Miranda's emergency HOA meeting was a pathetic final gesture. She called for an immediate property seizure vote before the federal investigation could conclude, but only 8 residents attended. Her support had completely evaporated after the aviation near miss. The motion failed 7-1, with only Miranda voting for seizure. Even Robert had finally found enough backbone to vote against her, muttering something about proper procedures and community safety. The encrypted message that arrived on my military phone that night changed everything I thought I understood about this entire operation. It came through a communication channel that only 5 people in the world have access to, a secure network reserved for the most sensitive national security communications. The message contained a single photograph, Miranda in federal custody, but she was smiling. Below the image was one line of text that made my hands shake. Phase 1 complete, initiating Phase 2. Thank you for your cooperation, Deputy Commander. I stared at that message for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to process what it meant. Miranda hadn't been the mastermind. She'd been a tool, just like everyone else. Someone had been using our entire community, including me, as pieces in a much larger intelligence operation. My military expertise hadn't saved us from a conspiracy. It had been part of the conspiracy all along. Every decision I'd made, every action I'd taken to protect my family and community had somehow served purposes I didn't understand. Tracy found me in the kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at the encrypted phone like it might explode. "Jack, what's wrong?" When I showed her the message, her teacher's instincts kicked in immediately. "This doesn't make sense. If you were a part of some plan, why would they tell you about it?" That was the question that kept me awake for the rest of the night. Why reveal the conspiracy to someone who had supposedly been manipulated by it? Drop a comment if you've ever realized the whole story was bigger than you thought. What was your moment of discovering everything you believed was just the surface layer of something much more complex? The federal investigation was just beginning. Miranda was in custody, and our community was trying to heal from months of manipulation. But somewhere in the darkness, someone was initiating Phase 2 of an operation I'd never understood, using intelligence I'd unknowingly helped them gather. I'd thought I was the hero of this story. Instead, I'd been a pawn in someone else's game all along. The community center had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered for Miranda's final confrontation. Federal agents, news cameras, attorneys, and what felt like half the county packed into a space designed for bake sales and school board meetings. Miranda still believed she could manipulate her way out of federal charges, sitting at the defendant's table with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of successfully deceiving people. She had no idea that her former victims had spent the past week comparing notes and building an airtight case that would destroy her credibility forever. County investigators tied her to identical schemes in 2 towns, just like ours, and proved the contamination was staged to trigger emergency seizures. That was the moment the room stopped defending her and started counting victims. The community confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in 8 years of small-town life. Tom Bradley stood first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd taught high school for 30 years and knew how to command attention. "Miranda, you lied to all of us. We trusted you because we were desperate after Hartfield closed, and you used that desperation to turn us into weapons against our own neighbors." Other residents joined the chorus of accusations. "You nearly killed those pilots. You tried to steal Jack's family land. You exploited Pete's financial troubles. You turned our economic desperation against us." Pete's testimony was the most emotionally devastating part of the entire proceeding. His voice broke as he explained how Miranda had discovered his financial vulnerabilities and weaponized them against his conscience. "She found out I was 3 months behind on equipment payments after Hartfield closed. She offered to cover my debts in exchange for betraying my oldest friend, and I was so scared of losing everything that I agreed. I was wrong. Jack was protecting all of us from being robbed, and I helped the person who was robbing us." Miranda's breakdown was spectacular and complete. The smooth professional facade cracked under pressure, revealing someone who'd built her entire identity around manipulating vulnerable people. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "I lost everything in the divorce. My business failed, and I just needed to rebuild my life." Her hands shook as she tried to justify actions that had nearly caused aviation disasters and compromised national security. "The tech company promised this was legal intelligence gathering. I was trying to help this community survive economically. My response was measured, delivered with the calm authority that comes from 18 years of military service and absolute certainty about right and wrong. Miranda, everyone faces financial pressure and personal setbacks. Not everyone chooses to steal from their neighbors and endanger military pilots for personal profit. You exploited our community's desperation after Hartfield's closure to serve foreign intelligence interests while enriching yourself through property fraud. The community unity moment was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. One by one, residents stood to show support for our family, creating a visual representation of how completely Miranda's influence had collapsed. The room was divided clearly between the overwhelming majority supporting us and a tiny group still defending Miranda out of misguided loyalty or remaining economic desperation. It was democracy in action, community healing happening in real time through collective recognition of shared manipulation. When the sheriff entered quietly during Miranda's desperate testimony, you could feel the energy in the room shift. She saw the handcuffs and stopped speaking mid-sentence, her expression changing from desperate anger to empty realization. No screaming, no final threats, just silent recognition that her schemes had completely collapsed and consequences were finally arriving. The woman who'd manipulated an entire community through their economic fears was reduced to quiet surrender in the face of federal justice. As the patrol car drove away with Miranda in custody, the community stood in stunned silence. Tom Bradley started a slow clap that built into sustained applause, not a celebration of someone's destruction, but relief that our town had survived sophisticated manipulation by foreign intelligence operations. We'd been tested by experts in community division, and ultimately our bonds had proved stronger than our economic desperation. Pete approached me publicly as the crowd began to disperse, and his words meant more than any official vindication could have. "Jack, I'll spend however long it takes restoring every inch of damage to your property. No payment expected, no contracts needed. It's what neighbors do for neighbors, and I should have remembered that 6 months ago." The handshake we shared felt like the beginning of rebuilding a friendship that had been damaged by forces neither of us had fully understood. The federal investigation revealed that Miranda's scheme was active in 12 other rural communities nationwide, using identical tactics to exploit economic desperation for property fraud and intelligence gathering. Our town had become the case study for identifying and stopping foreign intelligence operations that targeted vulnerable American communities. The small victory of saving one family's cornfield had helped protect military installations and rural communities across the country. But the encrypted message I'd received still haunted me as I watched our neighbors celebrate justice and community survival. Someone had orchestrated events that led to this moment, used our entire ordeal for purposes I didn't understand, and thanked me for cooperation I hadn't knowingly provided. Miranda was just one piece in a much larger operation, and her arrest might have been exactly what someone else had planned all along. 1 year later, I received a package with no return address containing a newspaper from a small town 200 miles away. The headline read, "Community Development Project Brings Jobs and Prosperity," and the photo showed a familiar-looking drone facility. But what made my blood freeze wasn't the facility itself. It was the photograph of the project coordinator. A woman who looked exactly like Miranda, using a different name, wearing the same confident smile as she prepared to exploit another economically desperate community. She was doing it again, somewhere else, to different families facing the same vulnerabilities that had made us targets. The conspiracy hadn't ended with Miranda's arrest. It had just moved to the next community, the next target, the next phase of an operation that treated American towns like testing grounds for foreign intelligence gathering. I picked up my secure phone to call Colonel Davis. It was time to stop this thing permanently, before more communities suffered what we'd survived. 2 years later, I'm standing in the same cornfield where this whole nightmare began, watching my father's legacy grow green and strong under federal agricultural protection that ensures it can never be seized for development again. Miranda received 2 years in county jail plus 5 years probation, along with restitution orders that funded the complete restoration of our property and compensation for every family she'd defrauded. Tech Flow Dynamics paid $50 million in federal fines, with executives facing espionage charges that sent a clear message to other foreign intelligence operations targeting American communities. The restoration work was more comprehensive than I'd ever imagined possible. Miranda's seized assets funded professional soil remediation that returned our land to organic certification standards, rebuilt our fence with premium materials that should last 40 years, and replanted Tracy's rose garden with heirloom varieties that bloom more beautifully than anything we'd had before. The irrigation well system was completely upgraded, and property value actually increased due to the legal protections and improvements. Sometimes justice comes with compound interest. Pete's redemption arc was one of the most satisfying parts of this entire ordeal. He personally oversaw every aspect of the restoration as community service, working alongside me to rebuild not just property, but a friendship that had been damaged by forces neither of us fully understood. His construction business recovered, with community contracts funded by federal grants for towns that had been targeted by foreign intelligence operations. Shared work healing damage created a deeper bond than we'd ever had before. Friendship forged through adversity, overcome together. New HOA leadership was elected with transparency requirements and financial oversight that prevent future manipulation. We established a community fund to help neighbors facing financial crisis, removing the desperation that makes good people vulnerable to exploitation. The elderly veteran who'd voted with us during our darkest moment became president, bringing military discipline and constitutional principles to neighborhood governance. Sometimes small-town democracy works exactly as it was designed to. Tom Bradley became our community's advocate for education about economic manipulation tactics, traveling to other towns facing similar threats. We almost lost our souls to outside money exploiting our desperation, he tells audiences across rural America. Education and mutual support are our best defenses against sophisticated predators who target vulnerable communities. His teaching skills found a new purpose in protecting neighbors from the kind of manipulation we'd survived. Tracy's documentation of our ordeal became a national platform for families fighting HOA abuse and property fraud. Her detailed records helped FBI investigators identify patterns used by foreign intelligence operations targeting rural American communities. The book she wrote, Fighting HOA Corruption, A Military Family's Victory, became required reading at community colleges teaching courses on property rights and local government. Sometimes, surviving trauma creates opportunities to help others avoid similar pain. The annual Harvest Festival held in our cornfield became a community tradition celebrating the victory of honesty over manipulation. The entire neighborhood attends to celebrate, with families who had learned hard lessons about economic desperation and community resilience. Former Miranda supporters openly acknowledge their mistakes and share stories about recognizing manipulation tactics. Children play among cornrows while parents discuss protecting their families from future threats. Our community became a case study taught at universities researching rural economic exploitation and foreign intelligence operations. Students learn how economic desperation makes entire towns vulnerable to manipulation, how sophisticated adversaries exploit American openness for intelligence gathering, and how individual courage can protect communities when institutions fail. Academic interest in our story helped identify similar operations nationwide. When new military families move into our neighborhood, I teach them the warning signs of HOA abuse and community manipulation. The most important battle you fight might protect people you've never met, I tell them, sharing lessons learned from our ordeal. Military service doesn't end with retirement. It evolves into protecting communities from threats that don't wear uniforms, but target American families just as deliberately as any foreign adversary. The encrypted message mystery was finally solved when Colonel Davis briefed me on a classified operation I'd unknowingly assisted. My technical expertise and community standing had made me the perfect unwitting asset for exposing foreign intelligence networks targeting military installations. Every action I'd taken to protect my family had served larger purposes I hadn't understood, helping identify and shut down operations threatening national security across multiple states. Federal legislation strengthened rural property rights protections and enhanced legal resources for military families facing property disputes. The Miranda laws, named after our case, require environmental impact studies for all community development projects and mandate federal oversight of drone operations near military installations. Sometimes personal victories create systemic change that protects thousands of other families. Local high school curriculum now includes courses on community manipulation tactics and economic exploitation. Students learn to recognize sophisticated fraud, understand property rights, and identify foreign intelligence operations targeting vulnerable populations. Jack's cornfield transformed from a target of exploitation into a symbol of individual courage, protecting community values against sophisticated threats. 47 families nationwide contacted me for help fighting similar schemes after our story became public. Federal investigators used our documentation to identify and prosecute foreign intelligence networks operating in 12 states. Military response protocols were updated based on aviation safety lessons learned from our near-miss incident. One family's stand for property rights helped protect communities and military installations across America. The final twist came 3 years later when I received official recognition for distinguished civilian service in counterintelligence operations. The ceremony was classified, but I can tell you that sometimes the best way to catch sophisticated enemies is to let them think they're manipulating you while you gather evidence of their crimes. My father's cornfield had become an unwitting battlefield in a much larger war, and somehow, we'd won without ever knowing we were fighting. Today, I tend corn and watch F-16s navigate airspace I help coordinate, knowing that individual courage to resist manipulation can protect entire communities from sophisticated threats. Family land remains in family hands, neighbors learned valuable lessons about economic resilience, and honest people prevailed through persistence and mutual support. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from simply refusing to let bullies win, regardless of how sophisticated their tactics or how powerful their backing. The cornfield my father planted with dreams of peaceful farming became a symbol of American resilience against foreign manipulation. Not bad for a boring government job and 12 acres of corn. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from ordinary people refusing to back down when everything seems stacked against them. That's what we believe here at HOA Stories, that every voice matters, every stand counts, and every person has the power to change their world, one story at a time. If this story of standing up to corruption and fighting for what's right resonated with you, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. Goodbye,